Fellow Americans, this is a recording made at the request of thousands of people across our country, as well as many thousands of prisoners in Soviet slave camps, with whom John Noble spent 9½ unforgettable years. This story is recorded that you might know the truth about communism. And now, here is John Noble to tell you his story in his own words. Mr. Noble.
This is John Noble. My story is not a pleasant one, for it concerns not only those unfortunate ones behind the Iron Curtain, but it also concerns every American citizen, including you. I was little concerned about communism. I was little concerned about the political developments inside of our own country. Not at all concerned about the spiritual matters back home in Detroit, Michigan, where I was going to school. I was just an average American boy. My father, out of nothing, built up his business, a business that proved to be very prosperous. Materially, we were blessed beyond compare. But then my father became ill, had to attend medical treatments over in Europe, in Germany, in Czechoslovakia. But while Dad was over there in Europe, he invested money. He purchased factories here and factories there. We had most everything that the world had to offer. But while Dad was taking care of his health, my mother, brother, and I were taken over to Europe to study in one of my father's factories. And while we were beginning to do so, and the war broke out, we as Americans were locally interned under Hitler, and we were kept under this local internment throughout the entire war until 1945, when World War II came to an end. And we, of course, as Americans, expected to find our freedom. And yet, it proved to be quite the other way around. But just shortly before the end of the war, on February 13, 1945, as possibly some of you recall, the greatest air raid of World War II was flown. The air raid against the city of Dresden. Dresden, Eastern Germany, the city in which we were held throughout the entire war. We were in the city that night. We were in the basement seeking protection. And as these 4,200 American and British bombers were flying over that city, they dropped their bombs within approximately 50 minutes. Of course, we were in the basement, as I say, seeking protection. Friends, possibly relatives, flying above, dropping the bombs. The walls were shaking, the plaster was crumpling from the ceiling, the windows blown out, the roof partly uncovered. But physically, nothing had happened to us. But from this day on, through the end of the war, many people in Dresden, people in other parts of Eastern Germany, were literally on their knees praying, Lord, protect us from the West and let the Reds come in. Merely because they hadn't experienced anything like this from the East, not knowing how horrible it could be. But as these last few weeks of the war came to an end and the Soviet troops did begin to move in, it was May 6, 1945. About 7 in the morning, after the troops had moved up to the city limits, we pulled up the stars and stripes on the roof of the building. And suddenly all over the city, as far as we could see, white flags coming out all over. The city was surrendering. But as these Soviet troops moved in, those very same people that had been praying, Lord, protect us from the West, were again on their knees, but their prayers were different. Their prayers were different because they prayed, Lord, why didn't you take our loved ones? Why didn't you take our possessions with the bombs instead of having the Soviets take them? Because those things that the Soviet troops displayed as they moved in were so much more horrible than what had happened during that terrible air raid in this one night. If we could give you a picture of what was taking place on this May 6th, as these Soviet troops are moving in, it would be a picture of a beaten army, the Soviet army. The German troops had moved out of the city the night before, even though we hadn't known it. But when these Soviet troops moved in at 8, and we saw them coming in through the streets and through the alleys, it was a beaten army, as I say, torn and tattered uniforms. Some of them even partly German uniforms on their bodies, some with a boot and a shoe, some even with rags wrapped around their feet, many of them having beards, not having shaved themselves for a long time. Most of them even looked as though they hadn't washed themselves for a week or two. Almost all of them completely intoxicated, and many of them infected with the various diseases, which we here in America have no conception. Those very people that had been praying before had changed their prayers. What they saw here was a godless satanic force moving in. These things have not changed. Communism today is the same communism it was in 1945. The face, of course, has changed. The average citizen in the other parts of the world has received an impression that these things no longer go on. But undercover, it's the same today as it was when the Soviet troops moved in. We as Americans had the stars and stripes flying across our route. The Soviets did not set foot on the property. We had contact even with the American authorities in the West, and they assured us that nothing could happen, seeing that we were Americans and the Soviets our allies. But only 2 days later, Soviet officers and guards moved in, tore down the stars and stripes, tore them to pieces, burnt them, and arrested both my father and myself. My mother and my brother were kept under house arrest, while Dad and I were taken off to prison. But at the time when they tore down the stars and stripes at our place, they tore them down in eastern Germany, wherever they could find them. Also, we were not the only Americans arrested at that time. Many, many more. Figures that cannot be determined exactly. But while Dad and I were taken off to prison, a new life began. A new life that brought many changes. Unexpected things were facing us. I'd never been in a prison before. This Dresden prison, a 5-story prison building, the cells all around the edges, a hollow center in the middle, just small catwalks around the sides for these 5 stories of cells. Dad was put into solitary confinement right across the hall from me in cell number 29. I was in cell number 5. Just a small, naked stone cell, a bunk, a bench, a table, a tin pan, and a spoon. No one to talk to. Nothing at all to occupy the mind with. Nothing to do. A small window to look out into the sky, and on the other side a solid metal-plated door separating me from the hallway. Just a small, tiny spy hole for the guard to look in to see what the prisoner was doing. And I remained in this small cell for approximately 7 months without even setting a foot outside of the door. And during these 7 months, not once an explanation, not once an investigation, not once an answer to all of my questions. My question, why did they put me here? But I was protesting. I was an American. They had no right to do this to me. But the guards just laughed at me. Or just as they keep on laughing to all those other Americans that they still hold in their prisons over there. But I kept on protesting until July 28, 1945, when something began to happen that changed my whole outlook upon life. And this something was a starvation period. A starvation period, of course, its length we did not know. But prior to this first day that we went throughout the whole day without a crumb of bread and without a spoonful of soup, many weeks of inadequate food had worn us down to skin and bones. Being in this physical poor condition, on this July 28th, after this entire prison, 700 people went throughout the day without anything to eat, where they began to knock against their doors. They began to call and to curse and to scream and to beg, and some possibly even to pray. But I too was becoming weaker and weaker. I lay down on my bunk that night, and I had a problem. That problem was, did I have the right to turn to God and ask God for food and for freedom? Well, all those years in the past, where I had such a wonderful life, I did not even take time to say thank you for it. I just took all of my blessings for granted, just as possibly many of you take your blessings for granted. I didn't know if I had the right to turn to God and ask God for food and for freedom, since I had ignored him for such a long, long time, but I tried it. I laid down on my bunk and I closed my eyes, and I prayed and I asked the Lord for food and for freedom. Inside, something gave me confidence that I was going to receive it. But the next day came, and there was nothing. No food, no freedom for the entire prison. I prayed more seriously that second night. Oh, I complained to the Lord how hungry I was, how innocent I was, that the Russians just had no right to do this to me. But the third day came, and there was still no answer to prayer. And I was so disappointed and so discouraged, I said to myself, well, it's useless for me to pray anymore. So I didn't pray. But the next morning, to my surprise, we had a slice or two of bread. We had some watery soup at noon, and we had some watery soup at night, and this made me confused. Confused? Because when I did pray, I did not receive. And then again, when I did not pray, I had something to eat. I didn't know how God answers prayer. I didn't know how to pray. My prayers were typical prayers for us in the Western world, but no prayers at all in the sight of God, because all what they amounted to was, Lord, I want this, and Lord, I want that. But Lord, I don't want this, and Lord, I don't want that. But I didn't understand any better at that time. Well, we had food for 2 days, and then a new starvation period began. A new starvation period that lasted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 days. 12 days in a row without a crumb of bread and without a spoonful of soup. And as the second starvation period began, I began calling again. People began to knock again, to curse again, to scream again. Some people going out of their minds. Some people committing suicide. Others being executed. Hundreds literally starving away. And I, too, was becoming weaker and weaker. Actually, the only strength that I received during these days was when I looked through my little spy hole across the hall to my father's cell, when it was time for the water bucket to come around again, and I could see my father as his door was open, stretching out his tin pan, waiting for the guard to fill it. Oh, and I said to myself, well, as long as Dad can stand it, as long as Dad can take it, why, certainly I ought to be able to take it. But it was just about in the middle of the second starvation period when I, too, was physically finished. I was so weak that I couldn't lift my feet off the floor. I couldn't talk anymore. My voice was gone. But that night as the water bucket was making its rounds, when I could hear the guards unlock one cell after the other, and I could hear one door slam after the other, and they were coming closer and closer and closer to my cell, and as they opened up my door, I could barely slide forward to receive the water. And while the guard was pouring the water into my tin pan, if I would have had the voice to call, I would have called across the hall to my father and would have said, Dad, this is the last time you're going to see me because I'm finished. But I couldn't call. I didn't have the voice to call. And before I knew it, the door was closing in on me again, and I stood behind the closed door holding onto this tin pan of water, holding onto the wall and looking through the little spy hole, watching that water bucket make its rounds, until it came over to my father's cell, just to see my dad once more. And after his cell was closed, I slid back to my bunk. I drank my water, and I began to pray. But my prayer was different. It was different because I prayed, Lord, close my eyes and keep them closed. I can't stand this any longer. The pains of hunger were just eating me up inside. I just couldn't bear it anymore. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I didn't want to have any part of this world anymore. I just wanted to get rid of everything. But then I added, Lord, if you don't want to close my eyes, then, Lord, you take my life and make it whatever you want it to be, because I'm finished. If there's a life, Lord, it's not mine anymore, Lord, it's yours. And that's where things began to change. From the next morning on, it seemed as though I could walk again. I could talk again. I felt like singing in that cell. Merely because I turned my life over into the hands of God. I mention this whenever I have the opportunity, because the communists wanted to destroy me. They were successful in destroying me up to that moment when I said, Lord, you take over. The communists are determined to conquer the world. The communists are determined to destroy anything and everything that is good in this world. Unless we can get our nation on its knees before God, the communists will get our nation on its knees before communism. There is no in between. Both Dad and I had survived the starvation, and yet it was many, many months before we found out what really had happened. Out of all of these 700 people that were in the prison at that time, in this Dresden prison, only 22 or 23 survived. That is all. 670 some died, committed suicide, or just simply were executed. But after the starvation was over, there were still approximately 7 months of more or less solitary confinement. And during these 7 months, not once a piece of soap or toothbrush or toothpaste or haircut or shave or bath or anything like that. What we looked like and what we smelt like, well, you could hardly imagine. Not even a piece of clothing to change, not for the men and not for the women. The only time when I slipped out of my clothing was when I turned it inside out to crack the lice and the fleas and the bed bugs and so on. And we had loads of them. Sometimes when I speak to various groups across the country, and some of the small children are sitting in the front, and when I mention 7 months, no soap, no toothbrush, I see the smile going across the faces of these young ones. It was right down their alley. But for us in the prison, it was horrible. It is hard to find the words adequate to describe these conditions. But we survived. And it was early 1946 when I was fortunate to get a job in that prison. To do work like scrubbing floors, cleaning up the hallways, passing out water, later on passing out food, and from March 1946 on, I was put in charge of the office work. These records that I had were the records of 21,000 people that had passed through this one prison in less than a year. But also while I was doing the work, I saw the daily procedures. I saw how they were bringing new prisoners in, how they were forcing these people to sign confessions. Some of the tortures that these people were subjected to, too gruesome even to talk about. Often I was called to the prisoner doctor to help him take care of some of these individuals. Sometimes men, sometimes women, sometimes even only boys or girls. As they came back from the investigation, taken to the doctor's office, there I helped the doctor pull out the pieces of skin and blood and shirt that had been whipped into each other on their backs from necks down to their hips. The Soviets did not use whips to do this. They used copper tube. But after the individual broke down and signed whatever the Soviets wanted them to sign, they were taken across the hall to the so-called courtroom. And there, without a judge, without a jury, without a trial, merely a piece of paper stating that they had been sentenced to the various years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, lifetime, or even death sentence. After receiving the sentence, those that had been sentenced to the various years were sent on to the concentration camps in Eastern Germany or the Soviet Union. But those that had been sentenced to death, they remained in their cells for approximately 6 weeks. And after the 6 weeks were over, one after the other was taken out into the hallway. There in the hallway, they were stripped of their clothing, no matter if man, woman, boy, or girl. The youngest that I personally saw being executed was a 12-year-old. But after their clothing was stripped, I had to take the clothing off the floor. 2 guards stepped to their side, a junior officer behind them. They marched them out the side door. 2 minutes later, they came in to take the next one. Marched the next one out, and the third one, and the fifth one, and the 10th, sometimes 20, and sometimes even up to 30. And as the last one was marched out, we workers had to roll barrels of gasoline through the building, which was poured over the bodies, and they were burnt. And this was going on week after week, month after month, year after year, and is still going on today. After seeing these things go on for 14 months, I was shipped on to the concentration camps of Mühlberg and Buchenwald. Camps most notorious under Hitler, and yet more so notorious under Stalin. Mühlberg, a camp located some 40 kilometers north of Dresden, also on the Elbe River in eastern Germany. A camp of 16,000 prisoners at the time when Dad and I arrived. These 16,000 were held there as far as they survived for approximately 2 years before being shipped on to the camps of Buchenwald. But during these 2 years, we buried close to 9,000 out of these 16. In Buchenwald, a camp at the time when we arrived, counting 14,000 prisoners. But here at Buchenwald, also again during a period of close to 2 years, we buried close to 10,000. 10 out of 14. They didn't gas them, they didn't burn them, they just simply starved them to death and buried them. But after spending these 4 years in the various camps with my father, I was separated. Dad was taken back to prison, I was taken to court, sentenced, and shipped off to the Soviet Union. The court sentence was very simple. A tremendous hall in the prison of Weimar. Red drapery all around the sides, red carpet on the floor, one table in the middle with a red tablecloth over it, a girl sitting on one end, an officer at the other. And as I stepped in, the girl asked my name. I told her. She took a piece of paper and pushed it towards me and told me to sign it. I said, "What is it?" "I don't understand Russian." This girl said, "This paper states that you have been tried by a court in Moscow and have been sentenced to 15 years of slave labor." I said, "For what? For what reason? I've never been accused of anything." The girl said, "If you have any question in regard to your sentence, ask in the camp to which you will be taken." And this camp was high up in the Soviet Union, in the Arctic Circle. But what I found in the Arctic Circle, what I found in the Soviet Union, and what I received, the insight I received into this godless satanic system, I will tell you on the other side of this recording. After spending 4.5 years in the prisons in East Germany, Dresden, Mühlberg, Buchenwald, and Weimar, I received my sentence and was shipped off to the Soviet Union. The transportation went from Berlin in a so-called mail car, a postage car, through Poland to Brest-Litovsk, the Soviet border. As we arrived at the Soviet border, we were shipped over into another prison car called the Stalopinsky. A prison car, difficult to identify by an outsider. Small windows along one side, the side where there's a hallway and the guards are patrolling up and down. Next to this hallway, a line of bars. Behind these bars, one cage next to the other. In the cages again, 3 shallow shelves. So shallow that we could barely turn around in them, and yet we were packed on these shelves like sardines in a can for approximately 6 weeks. And during these 6 weeks, only dried bread, dried fish, and plenty of water. But this trip was interrupted 3 times in 3 different prisons: Orsha, Moscow, and Vologda. Prisons well known to all of those people that have spent some time in the Soviet Union. Every prison had something very unusual about it. The immorality in the prison of Orsha, the juvenile prisoners in the prison of Moscow, the Krasny Press, and then the rats in the prison of Vologda. But after leaving these prisons and being shipped straight up north, approximately 1,400 miles north of Moscow, we arrived at the camp area called Vorkuta. After having crossed the timber line, the trees disappeared. The bushes disappeared. Vegetation came to a complete stop, and yet we were still traveling on to the very north tip of the Urals. Up there, at approximately 12,000 feet of elevation, high mountain ranges on the west, the south, and the east. A high plateau, the Vorkuta Plateau. And as the train pulled in from the north and the doors were open, before us we had a forest of pole and barbed wire, one camp next to the other. Approximately 200 camps, with a prisoner population of close to 500,000. But as I stepped out of the train car and looked at this forest of pole and barbed wire, I looked at some of the faces of those individuals hanging on the barbed wire, looking out, glaring at us, staring at us, wondering to see if they possibly could find a friend, possibly could find a relative, someone who could tell them about their loved ones. But as I looked at these faces, pale white faces, no smile, no laughter, no hope, no joy. And then I looked at the guards, the MVD guards, or the Red Army soldier guards that we had. The same dead-like white faces. And I said to myself, Lord, it's going to take another miracle to get me out of here. I was taken to the Peresilka, a camp used for distribution. Prisoners always arrive at this camp and then are sent out to the various camps as they are required. From the Peresilka, we were shipped to Camp Number 3, one of the larger camps at Vorkuta. And here, Camp Number 3 supplied the workers for the 3 coal mines of 12, 14, and 16. That is, the male workers. We had at Vorkuta approximately 70 to 100,000 women, girls and women, working in cement factories and brick factories, laying railroad tracks, building roads, and work of that nature, while the men were working under most primitive conditions deep, deep down in the coal pits. Just to the west and to the southwest of us lie the camp areas of Ukta, Inta, and Pechora. These 4 camp areas together, called the Greater Vorkuta Camp Area, had a total number of 1.1 million. At Vorkuta, though, we were living, working, and existing under most primitive conditions. The barracks in which we were living were long, narrow barracks, half under the ground, the rest covered with snow. In these barracks, 6-foot wide shelves, an upper and a lower shelf on either side, laying with our heads against the wall, our feet towards the aisle, man next to man. No blankets, no mattresses, no pillows, nothing like that, just the naked boards. At 6 in the morning, the guards came in and chased us up out of our barracks, off of our shelves. We'd step outside and wash our hands and wash our face with a little bit of snow, and then hurry off to the dining hall. In the dining hall, a chunk of black bread, a bowl of cabbage soup, and a scoop of cereal. As the Russians would say, klep, kapusta, и kasha. And after receiving this little bit of food, we were sent on to the coal pits. There was a narrow hallway between camp and coal mine. Not fenced in, only fenced in, no boards or anything like that. This fence patrolled by guards and dogs. A corridor that was approximately 2 kilometers long. But as we hurried through this corridor, dodging the blizzard and dodging the cold, temperatures had dropped down to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 below zero sometimes, and in few occasions even lower than that. But as we arrived out there at the coal mine, we received the small coal miner's lamp, and then down into the coal pits. 6, 7, 8, 900 feet under the surface, working under most primitive conditions. Exhausted, 12 hours later, we were arriving at the camp again. And there to the dining hall for our second meal. The second meal consisting of a bowl of cabbage soup, a scoop of cereal, and a small piece of fish. And that was just about it. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the same thing. Only every 8 or 10 weeks was this piece of fish replaced by a piece of reindeer meat. What we looked like, well, you can hardly imagine. I personally was under 100 pounds for approximately 8 years, just skin and bones. Every 10 days we had a day off to go to the bathroom, to wash ourselves, to wash our clothes, to mend our clothes, and as we would stand in line waiting for the water, and we'd look at the person in front of us, the seat bones rubbing through the skin, the elbows poking through the skin, the bodies full of sores. Well, we asked ourselves the question, well, how can these people still produce coal? The answer was simple. They had to. They had to, because if the individual or if the group would not produce whatever had been set aside for them, the next day they would only receive half of the portion of food. And with half of the portion of food, we knew that we could only exist a matter of days. But many of us did not only take the strength to do the work out of this chunk of black bread and bowl of cabbage soup. Many of us took the strength to survive and to do the work out of the secret Christian services that were being conducted. Services that were being conducted somewhere secretly deep down in the coal pits, at the end of the tunnel, where the cave-in danger was the greatest, where the gas accumulation was the greatest. There you could find an altar built up where some group was worshiping in secrecy. Others again, meeting together secretly in a barrack. 2 or 3 of the fellows patrolling up and down in front of the barrack for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, in many feet of snow, just making sure that no one would surprise us. And there, the men found strength by discussing and bringing glory to God and His Word. But many of us were caught attending these services, some caught teaching or preaching. And the punishment for those that are caught teaching or preaching was most severe, most bitter. It is difficult to talk about these things. Difficult because we, as a whole, sitting in our comfortable America, talk about the power of God. We read and we write about the power of God, but we don't really believe in the power of God. Up there, it was displayed. Because every single one, man or woman, that was taken into the dungeon and punished with a so-called religious punishment survived. And this punishment in detail was just a small cell, a naked stone cell. No heat, no warmth. Sure, it was protected from the sun, from the wind. But here in this small cell, they were held for 5 days. During these 5 days, only 2 warm meals. But worst of all, chained against the wall with their wrists and with their ankles, and a concrete block between their legs for 5 long days. Humanly speaking, hard to understand how a person can survive. But everyone in our camp did survive that was put into the dungeon because of Christian convictions. There was a man, for example, in my barrack, a man who had been caught 3 times and was taken off to the dungeon 3 times and chained against the wall 3 times. But when he came back that 3rd time, some of his own flock gathered around him and they begged him. They asked him, they said, Janusz, was it worth it? Was it worth being chained against the wall? And he stopped to think for a moment, and he said, why, I suffered, that's true. But have you forgotten how much Jesus Christ suffered for you? Surely most of us have forgotten. But he went on to say, he said, those days while I was chained against the wall were the days when I was closest to Christ. Janusz again was caught. But the guards didn't take the bother of bringing him into the dungeon. They took an iron rod and they broke both of his arms so he couldn't fold his hands to pray anymore. And how little time do we take for prayer? March 1953 came along, Stalin's death. And of course, with this news of Stalin's death, new hopes rose into the hearts of the people, hopes that the conditions would change. Promises were made by the scores, not a single promise kept. The uprising in East Berlin followed not too long after, and then the purge of Beria, the chief of the MVD, the chief of the secret police. And with the purge of Beria, unrest began to develop, because here was a man who was responsible for most of this imprisonment. Now he was purged. And so, not long after Beria's purge, the first great uprising against communism began to take place. The great uprising that began with approximately 100,000 prisoners at Vorkuta, an uprising in which I took part in. The uprising rapidly spread on to the ore mines of the Ural Mountains, down to the Moscow coal basin, and all the way over to the Ukrainian farms. For approximately 6 weeks, during the summer of 1953, the Soviet Union was practically paralyzed. But something happened in our camp at the outset of this uprising that thrilled our hearts. Something that those guards that had dug their trenches around the camp never dreamed that they would see in the Soviet Union. It happened in many other camps too, but I couldn't report the figures. In our camp, for example, out of these 4,500 people in our small cage alone, approximately 4,000 of them gathered together in front of the gateway and went on their knees and prayed. A sight that the guards never dreamed that they would see. But those men were trembling as they were praying because they didn't know what could possibly happen the very next moment. As I say, the uprising lasted for about 6 weeks. Then General Maslenikov, the Assistant Minister of Internal Security, moved up to the Arctic Circle with 2 divisions of armed forces. They dug their trenches around the camps, and on August 1st they opened fire. A most horrible bloodshed, a bloodshed only comparable to that of Hungary. And those people, those that had survived, those that had been praying, they came up to me and came up to others and asked me why. Why didn't God hear our prayers? Why did God tolerate this blood to be shed? I think I know the answer. Those people, these men, were extremely dedicated while they were on their knees praying. They're just as dedicated while they were chained against the wall in the dungeon, or while they were attending their secret Christian services. But as they left these positions, and mingled with the average prisoner. They tried to be like the average prisoner. But God will never stand for that. If we want to be Christians, we have to be Christians all the way and all the time. That is, they had to, and we have to. We cannot hope and pray for a safe and sound future here in America unless we're Christians all the way and all the time. After the uprising was over, and those that had survived had to go back to work, those secret services continued. Denominational barriers were broken. No one asked, "Of which group are you?" The only question that was asked was, "Do you believe in Jesus?" But also after this uprising was over, all over the Soviet Union, unrest was boiling. Coal mines were being blasted, power stations were being blown up, dams were being blasted, railroad tracks being destroyed. And it seemed as though the Soviet people were ready to rise up against communism, ready to overthrow that regime, when news came from Korea about 23 American turncoats. 23 American boys that did not want to go back home anymore. 23 American boys that didn't care about America anymore. And this news was so successfully splashed across the Soviet Union that the Soviet people felt, well, what are we fighting for if the Americans do not even want to go back to America? But also after this uprising was over, I was sent to another camp. And in this other camp, with the help of God, I managed to sneak out a small postcard. A postcard that went all the way through to Detroit, Michigan, into the hands of my parents. Dad was at home, but I didn't know this. He was released in 1952 by the Eastern German authorities after he had been handed over by the Soviets. But this postcard was not just simply sent out. I never had writing privileges. Only a very few in our camp did have this privilege. And I took the card of one of these very few and sent it to distant relatives of mine in Western Germany. In the text of the card, I wrote these words: "Your noble nephew requests." Noble was written with a small n. This may sound odd to call yourself a noble nephew, but in my case it worked. The card, immediately after being received in Detroit, was passed on to the State Department. The State Department had been trying to get me out of the Soviet Union for approximately 8 years. But every note that the State Department had sent was answered by the Soviets. "We haven't got him. We've never heard of him." But now evidence was on hand. And with this evidence, pressure was put upon the Soviets. Note after note was sent, not a single one answered. In December of 1954, President Eisenhower personally intervened in my case and sent a personal note to Moscow. About 2 weeks later, I began to move out. First, I was taken away from the Arctic and brought down to a small camp near Moscow, the camp of Potma, a camp many of you have read about or have heard about. A camp located about 350 miles southeast of the nation's capital. But there at Potma, there were only about 400 people. These 400 people representing some 18 or 20 nations, whereas in Vorkuta we had people from some 72 different nations, people from practically every corner of the world. Some kidnapped out of their countries, others arrested as they'd been traveling, many of them out of armed or diplomatic services, but the Soviets simply denied their existence. Down here near Potma, in our camp, amongst these 400 people, there were 2 other Americans. One, a fellow by the name of William Verdeen, a half-breed Indian from Louisiana. The other one, a fellow out of the Pittsburgh area. And when I met with these 2, I began to tell them what the Lord did for me in the prison, during the starvation, in the camp, during the operation, later on also in the Soviet Union, how the Lord took care of me down there, deep down in the coal pits, and also during the shooting of the uprising. But as I told this to these fellows, they said, "Never mind. We're born as atheists, and we're going to die as atheists." And believe me, that hurts. That hurts when you see people from 72 different nations hungry for the Word of God, and then you find 2 of your own countrymen and say, "We want no part of it." But I tried, and I tried, and I tried to get through to these 2 fellows. Apparently, I couldn't do it. Early January 1955, as I left the Soviet Union, left Potma to be taken to Moscow, William Verdeen was kept behind. The other fellow went along with me. And as we said goodbye at the gateway, Verdeen said to me, he said, Johnny, back home in America, then as an American soldier in Germany, and now as a prisoner here in Russia, no one has ever treated me as good as you have. It's probably because you're a Christian. Now, I'm not saying this to brag about it, but I am saying this for this lesson's sake. We often cannot get through to people with words, but the way we live our daily lives, this can hit home. After leaving Potma, I was taken to Moscow. There they gave me the red carpet tour around the city. They showed me all the things that they are so proud of. And after leaving Moscow, I was sent to Berlin. I was under guard for approximately 20 minutes when the door opened and an American officer and two State Department officials walked in. And when I saw the U.S. on the American officer's uniform, it just seemed as though my knees were ready to cave in, to realize that I was free again. A few moments later, I was taken down to the car and driven over to West Berlin, taken to the American headquarters, and right inside the door at the American headquarters, the Stars and Stripes, the emblem of freedom, the emblem of the greatest nation in this world. And as I saw the Stars and Stripes, tears came rolling down my cheeks because I hadn't seen this flag for so many, many years. The news reporters that were gathered around me, they found it quite unusual that someone could have emotional feelings when they see the flag. And I didn't understand it, but I surely understand it now. We often here in America, more often here in America, disrespect the American flag than we respect it. After leaving Berlin, I was flown to Washington. I spoke before the various congressional committees. I spent many weeks and months with the various branches of our government, briefing them on the things that I saw and heard while I was in the Soviet Union. But then I began to travel across these United States. And as I began to travel, I began to realize mainly two things. First of all, what I had told those people over there about a Christian America was all wrong. We just don't have a Christian America. As I go down the major streets of some of the major cities in our country and see some of the signs in front of the shows, some of the billboards, some of the magazine stands, watch some of the programs on TV, it's a most horrible example of a Christian nation. The other thing, I found that those very same things that brought Hitler into power in Germany and communism into power in the Soviet Union were beginning to grow right here in our beloved America. Based upon the socialist, communist philosophy of wanting something for nothing. There is no such thing as something for nothing. Communism and socialism are satanic movements, contrary to what the Bible teaches. But as I travel, and as I speak across this nation, I find so many evidences that our nation no longer is looking towards these things. Our nation has come to that point where we honestly would have to say, the state is my shepherd, I shall not want. We as a nation have turned our backs upon God. There can be no future for a nation that takes this kind of a step. We are slipping in America, rapidly slipping towards those very things that are existing in the communist world. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to let our nation slip? Are we going to slip with our nation? Or are we going to stand up and make this nation the great nation that it used to be? A nation based upon the Word of God. A nation with its Constitution and its laws founded upon the Word of God. Are we going to let it slip? But if we want to save this nation of ours, we'll have to do it very soon, because time is flying away. We can do it. We can save our nation. But we cannot do it without God on our side. And that means, first of all, that we ourselves have to make this big change right within our own hearts, bringing back to this nation those two things that made this nation great, the Word of God and patriotism. This was the foundation, and this has to remain the foundation of a great nation. We can do it, but it needs all of us. Everyone has to pitch in. We can bring this nation back to these two principles. Through school, through church, through all these other mediums of communication. We can bring it in through the various organizations inside of our country. But we need all of you. We need everyone to pitch in. It's up to you to do it. We alone can't do it. With God on our side, we can. We have the greatest nation in this world, the greatest heritage of any people in this world. We have the greatest governmental system of any system in this world. But we're going to lose it if you don't care. Do you care? Does anybody care? If you do, let's get back to those two principles, the Word of God and patriotism. You need Christ. We need Christians. We need a nation back on the Bible.